Our moderator today does all of the heavy lifting here in terms of introductions of our incredibly esteemed panelists. Like, I'm shaking and nervous to be up here, and I'm not exaggerating. Not Susan, I know her. Two of these people up here have no idea who I am, but that's okay. Darian Johnson holds an MFA. Darian, parade wave. That's him. Darian Johnson holds an MFA from Arizona State University and has been a visiting artist at the College of Creative Studies in Detroit and an assistant professor at Buffalo State College. He most recently transitioned from being a full-time studio artist in Copenhagen, Denmark, and he joined the Georgia State University program in Atlanta as an assistant professor recently. His work has been recognized nationally and internationally through awards, grants, exhibitions, residencies. In 2012, he had a little something called the Emerging Artist Award through something called NCICA. But before all of that fame and glory and international acclaim and travel, you guys don't know this, but Mr. Johnson was just a mere summer clay camp assistant from rural Minnesota, shuffling around the halls of Northern Clay Center. And I've had the great pleasure of knowing Darian for over 15 years. If I say how many years, really, you'll know exactly how old we are collectively. I think he's younger than me. And so I've known him for a long time as a maker, educator, and friend, and I marvel in his career advancement. And I know that when he talks about his success in the field, he does owe it all to Northern Clay Center, and he does that publicly quite often. He attributes his success. So I'll turn the microphone over to him and this esteemed group. You guys are going to have so much fun.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. Yeah, the Northern Clay Center, it really is a wonderful place, and I look forward to seeing it again in Minnesota next year at NCICA. So getting started, I'm starting out with maybe not a traditional ceramic image, but it is a ceramic artist. This is Ricciardo Teran, currently in Philadelphia, a former skateboarder. And I know there's probably a number of people in this room, maybe, or at least at the conference, who have a history of either skateboarding, snowboarding, rollerblading, the aggressive sports, right? Like, it's how I also grew up in a lot of snowboarding in Minnesota. And I start with this image because it talks about the relationship to something external in a physical way and how that frames the way you understand something. So it's more than just the idea of thrashing, right? When you develop this relationship where the object becomes integral to the way you're moving through space, it changes the way that you understand the space you reside in. Like, I'll never look at a handrail again the same way. Like, it's not just aiding me to go down the stairs. It's sort of shifted the way that I think about that. And like, I can physically understand the speed that I would need to be at to clear a set of stairs or to do something. And so how does that then translate to the making process? Oh, I hit the wrong button. I apologize. So the next slide, John Ruskin, I wanted to put in part because I just love the way he sees and translates what he sees onto paper, but also to acknowledge that this is really when this conversation started, right? The arts and crafts movement is really when we had a response to mechanized making. So it was creating an intermediary task between the artist and the maker. So the mechanized is a filtration that interrupts the intimacy between maker and object. So John Ruskin was actually an early advocate of photography when it was used more sort of as a tool or as an aid, but people would still sort of draw and render and look at the spaces they were rendering. But he became more critical as it became a sort of substitute, a filter instead of a thing that aided the hand. I wonder now if he would have come back to it after seeing more contemporary photography and how the process has gotten deeper and more engaged, and that process has led to new ideas. It's similar to the way that we discussed the wheel. So confession, this is just stock throwing image, but I wanted to talk for a second about throwing because we also talk about that as the tool often to our students. Like, think about it as a tool, but really thinking about it as a relationship with the device that helps us engage in this process and how that helps us understand the thing that we're approaching. So as a tool, it's just like a hammer, like striking a thing, it's a means to an end. But when you develop a relationship with the process or the tool, and it becomes more of a extension of yourself, like the difference between the skateboard being something I could pull something heavy I can't lift and just pull it with me, it's just acting as something that functions, and developing a relationship to the point where I can navigate my space differently. I can jump off of the sidewalk and onto a handrail and slide down it. Or subsequently snowboarding, in which I can navigate a mountain in a different way, and I can see the snow and start to understand the snow and how my movement through that snow would change. A similar thing can happen with a wheel, like how you really understand the vessel and how you really understand what you're touching changes when it's more of a relationship than just a means to an end. And I think that's the same thing with mold making. So in this image, it's essentially just a tool. It's taking a model and it's replicating that sort of stock standard vessel, and it's creating an end result. That's just an efficient way to produce an object, and it's not as much about letting the process sort of deepen your understanding of something. And it becomes a filter versus a near proximity in relationship to the maker and their thoughts. And so there is some really strong work in our history of making in studio arts. When it first became incorporated, does have strong work that utilizes the process as a tool. So Richard Shaw, Victor Spinski, Richard Notkin, Kurt Weiser, my former professor also, all using mold making to make really strong work, but also utilizing the process more as a tool. So it's to replicate an object, it's to create sort of a multiple of something, of an original model, but the conversation between the process and the end result isn't informed as much by the process as it is in some of my panelists' work. Robert Arneson also is another example. He used to sort of have a large mold of a general head shape and then use that to sort of expedite his process. So in Susan's work, she's using the idea of multiplicity. So Susan is over here. Say hi. Yeah, I'm introducing you guys as we go along. So Susan's work, originally making work that was of industry from Detroit, utilizes an extensive mold library and manipulates the casts in such a way to talk about the manipulation of our environment. And so I don't want to talk too much about it, but show you some examples and introduce her work to you, and then we'll get further into discussion with these guys. So other synthetic materials are incorporated in her work. So the flower at the top is synthetic foam. This is a modular piece that's put together. So Susan, technically some process shots as we're essentially talking about process. So a lot of her manipulation is happening post-cast, right? So she's got a clay body that's very plastic, very malleable, and she's able to work in an intuitive way after she has cast and creates sort of a visual abundance in front of her, and then assemble that into a tiled piece. Some details. And the way she handles glazing sort of interacts with those forms and has been informed greatly by the process of mold making. So there's that cyclical conversation of the content being developed and how her process feeds her ideas, as well as how the finished work relates to what she's making. So this is the goop shot.
Yeah.
So out of a residency at Kohler, correct?
Yeah.
So out of a residency in Kohler, seeing how they devised a way to attach unscored clay, she came up with this way to quickly sort of bag up slip and expedite her process of attaching all of these objects together. So it essentially allows the attachment of cast piece onto the bigger form. So Brian's work uses first bisque molds to create textures and then assemble those textures together. So throwing first predominantly, but also hand building. The textures are in a library. So it's a very simple way to have a mold. Take wet clay, push it up against an existing texture, and then fire that clay so it's bisqued, and then you can press clay into that to provide a texture for building. But having such an extensive library, it's similar to the way Susan has it, it allows him to combine different textures and build with the vocabulary a new story every time. So instead of having a mold that's creating something repetitively, it's creating a system that allows individuality to exist after the cast. So this is a process shot of how that's happening. And I think a lot about the idea of place. So from an urban environment, Philadelphia, Brian's visual vocabulary harkens from that space and growing up there. So there's this idea that the environment shapes the individual, which I think is present in this work. So while we all are shaped by our surroundings, environment, our biology, the building blocks are all similar, but there's individual identity when those building blocks are put together in new ways. And I think that's projected in this work quite strongly. So Brian has recently developed this keyless mold making system. So instead of throwing and then laying out slabs or using slabs directly and then hand building the forms, these are slip cast. And instead of the standard slip casting method in which you would make a model and then make your exact mold, in these pieces, he's gotten away or left behind the idea of the keys so that they don't have to sit precisely, so he can still create more unique combinations of textures instead of the same object over and over again. And what's interesting to me too is that knowing Brian, he's often after precision in a lot of aspects of the way he makes, but that this system that he's created also leaves behind something that's not exact. So I mean, even from the images that were sent to me, like how precise he's getting his measurements, that they fit together, but then there's this element of curiosity and letting go when he puts them together and they sort of slip and move aside and leaving that casting seam. So these are cut into quadrants, some in halves, some into quarters. And then the casting seams are sort of left as an integral part of the piece. So the process has a voice in the end result. Surface-wise, the texture is left behind, often raw clay. So you also have that tactile experience when you use these. These are functional works, and so the tactility of the work is really integral. So those decisions are also an intimate part of the process. So this is the casting seam detail. Jeff Campana, originally making work that was an individual object and then dissected and then reassembled. So that was very much about sort of the individual and acted as a metaphor for individual identity and an individual change through a process for Jeff in grad school, but acts as a metaphor for an individual change for people in general. Has then moved on to create a system of mold making in which the dissection happens not with the object individually, but with the dissection of the mold making process stepped back a few steps. So the manipulation is happening digitally to sort of dismantle what the mold can be and then reassemble to create the individual object. So each individual object resides and exists because it is a product of a dissected system. So these are created, as I said, digitally in Rhino, and then parts are printed, and then he's devised a way to cast the parts, and he'll do a better job of explaining it than I can because there's these strange steps where you have to CNC some other things and create the cast individual of each mold part. And then when he engages the mold, he's able to assemble and make some creative decisions on what can exist. So these also act as a metaphor of the dissection of systems. So where his original work talked about the individual shift and change that happens at a pivotal time in one's life, This is more criticism of social change and breaking down a system more broadly, and then trying to come together and change that system in a better way. So by using the vessel as an indicator of cultural metaphor. So we always have vessels from different points of time that represent, so the Roman amphora, and the Greek vessels, etc., all represent different cultural shifts. These exist as contours in flux, like social change happens within flux over time and continues to build up on itself. And you read it as sort of that futurist time-changing event to create one single object to get where you're at. Christina West had started using molds as a means to actually step away from ceramics and capture her engagement with clay and refine it in a way that is more precise, and allowed the sort of painting finishing that she was doing to be stronger and just more refined. So that from that point, she started doing hydrostone casting, pigmenting the hydrostone and scraping into it. And I'll let her explain also more specifically how the accident sort of happened to get to that point. But very much still a clay artist. She renders the individual portrait and again uses mold making instead of for specifically recording her clay engagement. She uses it to create a system in which she discovers something different. So the clay is refined to a higher level, and then a mold is made from silicone, which then does record her engagement with the process, with the clay, and her rendering of the individual. And then starts to pigment hydrostone and add layers. So the first layer is that sort of white, historically, it's referencing the history of sort of marble and stone sculpture. And then inside are these pigmented, flowing hydrostones that aren't going to be predictable when she carves back in. So these are the interior. Also reminiscent of Jawbreakers, I've got to just say. And her carving in. So it's another interesting thing. It's like somebody who originally used molds for refinement has come to a process to use molds to create a way in which control is given to something else. It's given to process. The process begins to not only have a voice and an aesthetic contribution to the end result, but also a integral part of the way she's thinking about portraiture. So instead of the physical manifestation of a sculpture that represents an identity, the internal landscape of somebody is sort of projected through color. I'm sorry, that was a little bit too quick, but and some process shots of her sort of scraping into a face, which is a little violent.
Gently.
Yeah, that's a good one. So, and I'm sorry if I went a little bit quick and didn't have you guys all raise your hands, but Jeff Campana is here. So mold system, Christina West is here, who we are currently on, Susan Biner, and then Brian Hopkins. Yeah, so we'll break into discussion from here. So this is everybody. And I'm gonna just relocate myself over there so I don't have to be the only person standing on stage. So, I mean, I'm going to start with Susan and just have you talk a little bit about your beginnings with mold making. It was, from what I understand, you were casting chicken. And
just told him that.
she did just tell me that, and how can I resist but to talk about casting chicken?
Okay.
And then,
I can't really talk about that.
It's okay, but you can talk. You can talk more about. Talk more about from. It went from chicken into your work at Detroit, in which you were casting found objects, screws, industrial objects that were indicative of the place that you were living,
Right.
and then gold lustering those. So there's this sort of contrast between the opulence and abundant aesthetic that is reminiscent of the Rococo, in contrast to this sort of work, blue-collar environment that you were in Detroit, and that was reminiscent of industry. So you can talk a little bit about that.
So at the beginning, can you guys hear me? I don't know. Okay. So I started using molds predominantly, besides the chicken part, that was like in graduate school. I started learning to make molds by casting chicken parts. I know that's weird, but that's how it started. And anyway, from there, after graduate school, I moved to Detroit. And in Detroit, my work was very much about the environment that I lived in, which was very much, like Darian said, blue collar environment, which was heavily traced with industrial parts and movements, and everything surrounding me was sort of engrossed in that. And I sort of became a part of that environment, became very influenced by it. And before Detroit, I mean, I came from New Jersey originally, so there's a big difference between the two places. And for me, living in Detroit was, I'm not sure what I really want to make at that point, and I was still in the captured by kind of the craft movement in terms of making teapots. I started making teapots, and I was doing that for a really long time. And connected to 18th century porcelains, I use molds as a way to capture the environment and use them as ornamentation on top of these vessels, which were completely sculptural in the form of a teapot. And I did that for years. And so molds became a language and a vocabulary for me based on industrial form. I literally used to go around certain blocks where they were blowing up buildings and walk around, they're imploded, so I would walk around the perimeter, and most people would take copper and things that were valuable, and I took like nuts and bolts and these just strange shapes that I have never seen, and then I would cast them and make them into ceramic parts. So that was my language, like up to that point. I don't know how far I should.
That's okay. I mean, you can keep
going,
going, yeah. You're right in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah, okay, well, so I mean, things change, because wherever I move, I've moved several times. I lived in California, and now I'm in Arizona. I lived in Philadelphia for a while. And I think my work is very much based in environmental concerns now. And so now my thinking process and my relationship with molds is different. The language is relatively the same, but how I use molds is very different in the kind of work that I'm making now. So maybe someone else should talk before I go on to the next thing.
Christina, so you came to molds as a way to refine the end result more. So you actually left ceramics to make aqua resin, but not clay.
Ceramics.
No,
You never left.
you didn't leave ceramic, but like you're not making
doing
ceramic
things in addition
objects.
to ceramics.
Yeah.
I mean, I also like the idea with molds of having multiples.
Right.
So I spend, 2 months, a month, whatever, sculpting a piece, and then it seemed like it made sense to be able to get a couple copies of that.
Sure.
But yeah, the molds allowed me to refine my forms more, so I can sculpt the clay with the most clarity you can get with clay, but inevitably, there's like waviness or tool marks or things that I couldn't get out. And I'm still trying to sculpt very smooth surfaces, and all those things become distracting when you get close to a piece. And so by translating the work into resin, which is very sandable, I could then spend hundreds of hours sanding and making the surfaces as perfect as I want. And then do I talk about how things shifted?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was making these molds, and I had something happened that I didn't anticipate, just with like learning different materials and things. I was casting the plaster, which is hydrostone, is just a very dense plaster. So I was casting it, and I liked this idea of pigmenting the plaster so I didn't have to have a painted surface, or something nice about the color being embedded in the material itself that seemed really appealing. But I had never done it before, and I like really intense, bright colors. If you're familiar with my work, like you know that. And so I put too much pigment in, and the plaster didn't set up. So it was in there like all day, and it was still like gooey in spots. Like it kind of set up in some spots, but not others. And so I thought I would just try to save the piece, and I scraped out the gooey stuff and then just poured new plaster in, but I didn't pigment that second batch. And so when I demolded it, I had this piece that had this like marbling happening in it, where it had the pigmented and unpigmented color kind of swirling together. And it looked bad, but I could see like the potential in it. Like, oh, this is something that I could do more purposefully. Like if I control this, you know, or do it more purposefully, this could become a really interesting idea. And then I started developing it from there.
I wonder if the first keyless mold that you made, Brian, was kind of a mistake. Was that something went off with a mold, or was it planned from the get-go?
This is Darian's opinion of me. Must have been a mistake.
Well,
I will credit Kayla Stein with my knowledge of keyless molds.
Okay.
She and I were sitting at a craft show in central New York, not selling any work because it was too good. And I was asking her how she made her work, and she said, oh, keyless molds, and she's explaining this to me, and this is maybe 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And then I thought, I love to make cups, but I also love to make these bigger vessels. And I wanted more time just to spend making bigger vessels, and everybody, all the cool kids started to slip cast everything. So I thought, oh, I should slip cast things too, so I can be one of the cool kids. And I was remembering back to that conversation with Kayla, and it was years, years had passed, but something just clicked, and and then I just went from there. But it also just made sense. Not wanting to make the same thing over and over, but just to have the same textures used over and over and make different objects, different proportions. Yep.
Yeah, it fit into your process really well.
Yeah, it did. Mm-hmm.
So what originally got you into the bisque molds? What stimulated that thought?
What got me into the bisque molds? I don't really know how to work with plaster so well, so you're right in your initial assumption. And I mean, I just, again, it was remembering seeing, Song Dynasty molds and how they were made. And I don't like having plaster in the studio so much, like most people don't. So I just took scrap clay and started slapping it onto things, and it made sense. Sure. That's why. Yeah, it's most things I do, I'm just trying to make sense of my own world, right? Like we all are. Yeah. And this just made sense to my process of making sense of my own world.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's a little bit quicker, more immediate. Yeah.
Jeff, how was the transition for you from really being invested in a very intimate, hands-on relationship with an object in clay to being quite a few steps back to getting to touch a clay? What was that transition like for you?
Okay, so for me, I basically kind of just lost interest in making the work before. So it was never like I just decided I should move my practice to molds. It was that I slowly stopped making any work at all. And part of that was about what that work was about, no longer being relevant to me as a person in my mind anyways. And what this is about the cut apart and put back together pottery that I was making was very much about, I didn't know this at the time that I invented it, but it was very much about some trauma related to my experience in graduate school, which was not my favorite period in my life. And as I learned that about the work, that is, if you think about graduate school being torn down and put back together in a superior version of what you started as. That's ultimately what that pottery became, its meaning became for me. And once I realized that, I thought maybe I should just work on my issues with that. And once I did, then I really didn't have an interest in making that work anymore. However, I'll always be interested in deconstructing and reconstructing. And I thought it would be interesting to attempt some very new work to me, new process and everything. I actually moved to Studio 740 in Helena, Montana a couple of years ago. I was so lucky to have that opportunity. And there, I sold my wheel before I left. I dismantled my studio, moved into a storage unit, went there with no expectation, and that just kind of materialized. I knew I wanted to play around with slip, and then over the course of that summer, I kind of figured out the way in which I would deconstruct, and that turned into the mold. I'll go a little bit further to explain. Then I returned to my school, Kennesaw State University, where we have all kinds of technology through the engineering and architecture department. And I was really able to make these things fully interchangeable only through the use of technology, because even though I guess I'm known for having some pretty fine control with my hands, I found that there was really no level of precision possible with the human hand that would allow for the kind of interchangeability that I wanted. And so therefore, I feel like I'm 2 steps away from the clay at this point. So I'm printing parts, I'm printing things that I'm CNC milling mother molds. So the word earlier is like I think of it as a modular mother mold.
Right.
So really what happens is when I'm creating in the studio, it's basically just the kind of the idea of creating form. It's almost back to a play-like kind of thing that I was missing in the other work. So I guess that's how it started.
So the element of chance also comes about with the building of the molds, right? So you're not exactly sure what's going to be there when you disassemble the mold, right?
Oh, yeah.
And just to elaborate on the idea of chance in that process.
Right. So, building in negative space is pretty interesting. There really isn't a way for you to tell what this thing is going to look like afterwards. But also that, I'm not thinking of a form I want to make and creating it. I'm usually just I'm testing against the system I created. So I'll stack up enough molds until I start running out of parts, and then rely on the ingenuity of trying to figure out just how to stack a thing to hold some slip to inform the next round of those. So pretty much, and this is still really early, but pretty much I'm in a phase where every single thing that I make is a discovery in some sense. Okay. And that was pretty much the opposite of where I was before.
With the other work, right?
Yeah, where I knew exactly what it was going to be like because I had already figured out everything hard about that work.
Right. Yep. That's similar for you, Christina. You were making work that was, you knew what was going to be there going into it for the most part. I mean, there's some decisions made.
I still do that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you still do. Yeah.
Yeah.
With your more full figure pieces, you understand what's going to be there when you're making it. Mm-hmm. But with this series, the bus series, there's that sense of discovery based on the process of mold making.
Right.
When you're revealing what's inside, that's left a lot to chance. What's revealed, right?
Right. So as I'm casting a bust, I know what colors I'm putting into the mold. So I keep a list, and I can, as I'm carving into the bust, I kind of can anticipate what color is going to emerge next. But I can't really ever anticipate what color is going to be dominant and take up most of the space on the plane, or what shape it will emerge in. That sort of depends on how the mold sits. Like after I rotate it around for a minute, and then I'll lay them down in different ways so the color pools more in certain areas. And then it depends on where I start to carve into the figure. So the angle that I approach the plane from affects you know, how the various shapes look. So yeah, the only thing I can predict is what colors are going to show through, but I don't really have a good sense of exactly what that will look like in terms of other aspects of it.
And how do you see that like playing into your content of those pieces? Like, how are you thinking of identity and portraiture?
Yeah, so this work is a lot about this sense of interior and exterior. So the planes give you a sense that you're seeing inside the figure, and so it's just like a really direct way at getting at the idea of interiority, of psychology, of emotion, of all those things within us that you can't really picture, you know, but it kind of gives us this sense that it's like a metaphor for that. And so it's so the unpredictability of what's in the figure, what's going to emerge from the figure, relates to this idea of the mystery of other people, you know. So we can never really understand other people as well as we understand ourselves. You know, we can never be in another person's head, so we can't really access that in a direct way. And so people just inherently have this degree of mystery. But we do understand them on some level too. Like, we're the same species, we experience similar things. So there's familiarity and mystery. And so I think of it as relating very much to that, where like I know kind of like a overall aesthetic that's going to emerge, and I know what colors are in the figure, but then these smaller details that I can't predict are analogous to like the nuances of a person's personality or emotion or mood or all of that interior kind of stuff that you know is mysterious about people.
Susan?
You know, I was just thinking, just after Jeff was speaking too, that this is really interesting because really, if you think about like systems thinking, you know, the idea of that, where the more you understand the system, the more you gain access to new information. I mean, in terms of what we're all doing, I think. And I'm sort of putting myself in that group as well, I guess. But I think that way as well because I use molds. Most of my molds are gang molds, so there's multiples in the mold itself. And if it's not obvious, I use it for obviously repetition and accumulation. And that becomes one sort of layer of something, and then I build layers upon layers upon layers. And it becomes this idea of creating a new system. And I think when I make a mold of something, I always think that you make a mold of an object or, you know, a prototype of some sort, but until you start casting it a lot, that's the only time when you really understand what you're actually casting. And I don't know if that actually makes sense, but I think maybe in my case, because when you create one cast versus 50 or 60 or more casts of something, and you're able to understand all the nuances of that form when it comes out of a mold, you really can see what changes you can make or what variations you can make on that form. And I think that becomes this sort of opening up of new information based on one mold, you know, or one form. It's kind of a, you know, I guess it's sort of a cyclic kind of continuum. But I think my work is all based in a system, and so I'm trying to understand systems. And certainly I work with plant biology, so that is a system, right? So it's all sort of connected together. And so you were talking about like what's unexpected versus what's expected, and the mold is kind of a control element, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's a permanent, you know, thing of the negative of the shape. But really, this element of what we're calling control can be changed and can variable, so that you can expect what it's going to produce. But then again, once you understand what that is, you can sort of turn that around and get a surprise out of it, you know, once you learn about it. I kind of sense that there's this sense of familiarity with a mold, and I don't know how to translate that exactly, but I always feel that way, that I use molds hundreds of times. I probably make 100 castings per mold, and then I have to make a new mold. But it's only until I go through a certain amount that I really understand what I'm casting, and then when then I sort of understand what I'm making. Even though at the beginning of my quote-unquote project, you know, you have an idea for this project, but until you make all your molds and understand what they can actually do for you in terms of thinking about the content, there are some surprises and, you know, out of this controlled element. It's interesting, you know, when you talk to everybody, and hear what everyone has to say about it.
So I wonder too, like how does the your development of understanding of that form then inform how you're deciding to deal with surface? Because a lot of your unpredictability comes from glaze interaction with in the kiln, like and how they flow and go over the forms. So are you making a lot of changes to the way you deal with the surface based on what you're learning about the forms from casting them a few times, or?
Kind of. I think I'm interested in, I love glazes, so I'm interested in the glaze sort of surface and content has to do with the context of the project and what I'm trying to get at. I think I'm really interested in glazes as a microscopic kind of element to a form, or how it flows over a form and creates something different on the surface. So to me, those are all, they're compiled. You know, they're layered and compiled on top of each other so that it has an understanding to what the project is about, if that makes any sense.
Sure, sure. Brian, can you actually also talk a little bit about your surface decisions and now you're working also with black clay and how the mold making process has informed some of those decisions and what you're doing?
Sure. Let's see. Like you mentioned, I grew up and I still live in a city. I live in Buffalo, and you know it's not the slickest city. It's pretty old. It's decaying, and I've always found beauty in decay. So with my use of the different textures, it just began as a way for me to make porcelain mine. You know, porcelain's seen as this lofty material, and it has this assumed worth. And I'm from a working class family, and none of that really made sense to me ever. So a lot of it was just accumulating these textures and having that library of molds that are familiar things to me, which are familiar things to most people, really. They're simple building materials. They're things, you know, people usually put on the floor, tend to ignore in their lives, but they help people get through life, you know, just maneuver down the street. And it's, you know, my work's all monochrome. You guys use wonderful colors. And, I was a math major, and I understand color the way most math majors understand color. So that's if you don't believe me, that was my piece before. So I'm now venturing from white into black.
Wow, risky territory.
It really is quite risky. I know. My therapist told me the same thing. But that is just, again, a remembrance of there was a big church in New York City, and my memory is it was at the end of Wall Street, okay, and it had through years of coal burning and soot accumulation, it was just blackened, and I love that.
Right.
Something to me it just kind of clicked, and I thought, oh, you know, I used black clay for the first time over 20 years ago. I didn't really know what to do with it. Now I really feel as if I know what to do with it. So you've seen the work, but if you haven't seen the work, just look at my website. You'll see some of the black work, and it makes sense. I only use the black as wood texture in general, only as wood texture, and it reads as kind of charcoal in that way, and again, burnt.
Yeah.
You know, something that would be discarded if you saw it. It's like, oh, it looks like burnt wood, so you'll make a drawing or you'll just throw it away.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And with the coming to the luster too, because that's one surface element that we didn't address, but it's also, you know, obviously gold harkens to the preciousness of porcelain and highlights that, but you're almost always using it to highlight that seam that's created with the keyless mold, which seems like that's the moment that talks back to the process a little.
Yeah.
Back to the blue collar element, really.
Right. Yeah. And I'm not interested, obviously, in covering the casting seams. I'm actually doing the exact opposite. I'm pointing them out.
Right.
if you were to see the bottoms of my cups, you can see those casting seams in the bottoms, and I like that. It gives my hand an interesting place to end up, you know, on a cup and to investigate. It gives me a place, you know, to apply those lusters, and I like the whole, you know, history of dinnerware. I also like the contemporary reference of platinum and gold, because it works. You know, it's that signifier of worth, and I like that. And it's another fired-on surface. It's another layer to add to the work. So yeah.
I'm a big fan of his raw seams, and I love raw seams. They're just beautiful. So good job, man.
Thank you.
Love raw seams.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I use the, if you guys know Harbor Freight, most of you know Harbor Freight tools, I use a toolbox saw to cut my molds with, because it's a stiff blade, but it's a coarse blade, and it leaves a really great texture there for the gold and platinum to play on top of.
Yeah. Seams are integral to the system work also, right, actually. Jeff? I think, yeah, predominantly, yeah. So, and then you're how are you thinking about the surfaces for yours, Jeff, and how you're resolving that?
I would say that I still have a great deal to do to resolve the surfaces. And that one thing is that the previous work, there's like a lot of there was only one glaze for that, what I was doing, and I found that glaze. And so that's like kind of a high standard to hold for, have I found the right exact glaze, or even is the right surface glaze at all for these things? Sure. And so, yeah, I guess in terms of just actual surface application, that's very much a work in progress. And with those seams, I've found I can enjoy those kind of the exposed flashing in everyone else's work, but when it's me, I really want those lines to take on a little bit of the role that the previous work, how lines really work to change how we perceive a form. And so, you know, say I have a blank spot that I want to just fill with cylinder, and I have all kinds of different, maybe like 1 wide and 6 tall next to 6 wide and 1 tall, or if I have a panel, when I subdivide that and break it, I want the lines to be quiet enough that we can still read a panel in the form as a panel, but also those little bits of flashing become kind of a reflection of the system itself. And that's the thing, I feel like most people, when they see, and only a few people really have seen the system, when they see it, they're totally amazed at the kind of like the level of precision that's going on and the variety that it can have. But I don't really want to show the mold as part of the work. Sure. And so I'm always working to have the mold become a better reflection, or the mold to yield something that's a better reflection of itself. And so therefore those little like parting lines are very, very important to me, both aesthetically and as part of the idea. And they are the continuation from the last body of work. So if I create, you know, lines through process in the previous work, I create a different kind of line because I have a different kind of process. Right. And so that was like one of the things that really slid quite comfortably from the previous body of work to the new. Mm-hmm. So.
I want to make sure also that I'm allowing the audience to ask questions. If you have any questions, the microphone is just in the center there. If you could please, if you're close and you can talk to us, it's going to feel more natural, but if you could actually just use the microphone, that would be great, because they need to get it on recording, and then we can all hear it. But if anybody has a question, please approach the microphone. Somebody's coming, so we'll.
Oh.
Hi.
Hi. I have been looking at your cups, Jeff, downstairs, and I love your forms, but I really am in love with your handles.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And so I'm inclined to think that they're hand-pulled.
Nope, those are right out of the computer itself. When that thing comes by, I bet the file is even there. But here's the thing. It took the reason I could make a handle on a computer that is comfortable and feels like it should on a pot is because I've pulled like 10,000 handles and stuck them onto pots. And I feel like that, you know, I didn't lose something by leaving a process behind that I was really familiar with. I feel like by moving to a new one, there's all this potential to take that knowledge and explore it in a new kind of way. Another thing about those cups that I didn't really hit on yet is that my idea, the grand scheme here is that I will be creating pottery for function, and all of those molds can easily just get absorbed up into the other system that creates those like hybrid vessels. And so it's like this multi-tiered thing that I'm trying to figure out. It's a huge amount of work, and it's like years in the making, but I'm making even those cup molds and those handle molds in ways where they can just be clicked right into the bigger system. And so every time I design a new pot, then I'm also designing a new fragment to later be combined. And so I feel like, you know, all this stuff is just kind of so new, but it's been interesting. I moved to the computer not because of any reason other than the pure necessity of the precision of the molds that I'm trying to go with. But I found that it is a wonderful way to make pottery. You can, if you make the handle and you don't quite like it, then you can just go back to the file and change what you don't like about it and print another one. And there's never this like back to the drawing board moment. Everything that I do, every experiment that I try, just gets pulled up into this larger collection of knowledge and parts. Right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask also, Christina, how do you decide who you end up sculpting? So, like, what is the decision into making the original model?
Well, I haven't done that many yet. I have 4 or 5 molds, and they're all portraits. So I like the idea that these are representations of people that exist, and the criteria is someone I've met, basically, because I take pictures, and I just want it to be a real person that I've had some sort of interaction with or relationship with. So far, I've sculpted family members, my mother, father, brother, grandmother. but it's not tied to that. It's just like I had a lot of pictures of those people.
Yeah.
So
second cousins in a little bit.
Yeah. We'll slowly work our way down to friends, and yeah.
So that's different from the way you would approach the full size. Well, not full size figures, but the 3/4
complete figures.
The complete figures. Thank you.
Yeah. The complete figures are. I use reference imagery taken from models to sculpt them, but I'm not trying to. I'm not thinking of the figures as portraits of the models. It's just the photographs serve to allow me to make the figure believable. So it looks like it could be a person who really exists, but it's the analogy I always give is a fiction writer creates a character in a novel, and you might really relate to a character and feel like you know that person, like, oh, that reminds me of Uncle Bob or whatever. But it's really just a character that the author made up. And so I want the figures to have a similar quality of like feeling believable, but they're not tied to a specific identity.
So did that decision-making process happen because you started to engage the mold making? Was that first? Like when was that idea seeded for that series to be more portraiture?
Right. So I first came across the process of layering color, and I had some bust molds that were these fictional characters, and then as I started to get into it and understand like where I wanted it to go, I realized that it was important conceptually that they really were portraits, not just kind of looking like portraits. And so that's when I made the shift for this series, for them all to be people that I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Susan, your models are changing a lot now. You talked about it a little bit, but that's also as being informed through years of mold making and a shift in the way you're thinking about the work. And could you expand a little bit more on how you're thinking about making your models and then making the mold of them?
Now most of my prototypes are not commercial. They're made by me. And for the past 2 years, I've worked with plant biologists. So one in specific is someone who studies root growth for, for growing more product. And so when I talk to him and we have discussions together and I see certain things in his research, I'm interested in taking those parts to make parts for myself. And I manipulate those into different shapes to create molds from, so they become the prototypes. And I actually have I'm a gardener myself, and I grow lots of different crops, I guess. So I have like this cutout space in my garden that it's a little bit weird, but I cut out a sections and I put in a plexiglass sheet so that I could see, so you can see through it, so you can see stuff growing, right? And you can watch it as it grows. You can also see we have a little rodent or something that crawls up and pulls the plants down. It's weird. But anyway, so they ate a lot of the plants this year. It's interesting to see and watch something grow, and you can, as you see it develop, you kind of come up with different shapes and forms, and it's all kinds of plants. It's vegetation to flowers to things that you would call a weed to everything. I just get ideas from that. So I've been doing that for a really long time, and that's given me ideas for molds. And also that because I make a shape and then I cast it and I cut it open and twist it apart and make something new out of it, I have learned how to almost take a shape and turn it inside out so that I can make a mold of what I think I want the interior to look like, and then cut that open and make it into something else. I mean, part of it is, again, it's like an expansion of vocabulary, but it's just a way of using molds beyond their initial object space. So now I kind of make molds from the inside out. So it's a little odd. I've just recently started working with I think this is really exciting. This is going to be my newest project I just started, but I'm working with two research scientists in cancer research, and I'm working on developing a project now about cancer research and development into ceramic, and thinking about how art can transform this kind of research into crossing over borders between museums to health center to people-oriented, and connecting those two things. So the shapes I've just started the shapes for those molds based on looking through a microscope, and that'll be next. But obviously it's not going to look like plant growth. It's going to look like something completely different. So things are changing. So we'll see. But anyway, that makes any sense.
But you've kept the screws, right?
The only thing I have kept is screws. So I'm like the screw. I have a screw in my ear and everything. But yeah, the only thing I've kept is screws. I don't know why, but I think it's sort of that connection to what is man-made, and natural versus man-made. And that discussion has been going on for a really long time. But I think it's always pre-existing, and so it continues to exist in my work. And sometimes you don't really see it outright, but it's embedded in parts of it. So I keep that.
Jeff, did you have an idea, when you created the system, did you have an idea of the aesthetic that you wanted the end result to be first? Like, usually when we're making a mold, we either find an object, we have an understanding for what that object's going to look like, or we model something where we know what we want to look like. But in your case, I wonder how did you have that preconceived idea of what it would be?
That's actually never been a way that I work with new ideas. Is I try not to think of, I guess my background is that the reason I fell in love with ceramics is the variety of processes that you could engage with. So it always felt weird to me that I spent a decade just throwing on the wheel. And the longer it went, the weirder that felt. But what I like about, or the way that I create new work is by just relieving any of the stress and just trying anything at all that comes to mind. And those are considered the sketches for me. So I've never sketched out something and then made it. That's not part of the process. What I usually do is I'll just make a bunch of intuitive things, and then I'll just assess that and then refine. So instead of like an idea execution, it's like execution, refinement, then I cycle back to look at what is within that work, and then that cycle begins again of refining out the things that I don't like and moving towards things that I seem to like from the process. But it's really important to me that process dictates more than, it's more, to me, process is kind of everything, and it's more important even than the idea that I'm trying to put out.
Sure.
And so in that way, what I did was I just created the most basic forms first when I understood that I wanted to dissect a system. Mold making just seemed like the most obvious place to start. Then I just started with cylinders. I started with truncated cones, spheres, and then as I needed simplicity in order to understand what was possible. And then as my understanding grows, more and more things can be added into the system, more and more shapes. And then as I moved on, my interest became much greater in sourcing actual functional pots rather than simple design elements. I really want every one of those parts, and I would say 50% of the parts I use now have identity, and 50% of them are just form. But all that came about through kind of like I work backwards from a lot of artists.
Okay.
And for me, it's just about the time in the studio. That's why I'm an artist. Is the best periods of time for making are the times when you have no idea or you have a slight notion of what you're going to make in the studio, and then you leave the studio blown away by the thing that you just created, not really understanding how, in fact, that happened.
Right.
That doesn't happen very often, but the best way to get there, I feel like, is by just listening to the work more than telling it.
Sure.
Right.
I wonder how that plays in for you, Brian, also. Like, are your textures, like the library of textures that you have available, are they influencing the form more, or are you developing a form, sketching it out, and then this is more in relationship to the bisque molds than the keyless molds. Are you sketching that out and then deciding on which textures are best for that form? How does that play out for you?
Yeah, I do. I work from drawings a lot. And then there's I sketch in a sketchbook, and then those drawings get translated onto a whiteboard in my studio, and then that gets transferred onto another drawing that happens on the clay before I start to add all the textures. But yeah, I have all the textures in mind before I begin. So there's no, yeah, I mean, I approach all this a little bit different than you guys do, but very similarly too, in that I let the process of the making really inform the content of the work, really. You know, I gain a lot of insight into why I make by just making. And I, you know, what you said resonates with me because I try to save every Friday in my studio as like play day, you know, where I make all these pieces and I don't ever just throw all the scraps away into a bucket. I keep them wrapped in plastic, and then I get my production done for the week. And then on Friday, I just kind of go in with no drawings at all.
Okay, so
and I just want to push. And yeah, you have those aha moments once in a while, right? That it's just like, I didn't know that could happen.
Right, and then
It's very cool.
like once it does happen, then you know it can happen, and then it just becomes part of your library.
Yeah,
You know?
completely. Yes.
That's what scraps are for.
That is what scraps. Never throw
are like
scraps
the
away.
best.
Your process is often very intuitive too. Like you're
it's fun.
creating abundance of forms, and then
Yeah, I take the scraps and I put them almost essentially similar to that. I have lots of scraps and I put them in just a separate bag, and then when I'm finished with the part that I'm making, I take those scraps and probably use them the next day and make something. And a lot of times it's just doesn't have to be anything I'm thinking about, just random.
so
And
will
it's really kind of interesting because you come up with something completely different that it's exactly the same. different work,
Yeah,
same.
you might have never seen or
thought.
thought of it before, and all
Right.
of a sudden it's
Like, oh,
existing right
wow.
in front of you.
I could
And it's
use
all-
this.
And it's all based on this mold, which are, are made really just to repeat,
Right,
and you're not repeating.
yeah.
And that's,
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. I wish it would happen a lot more,
Yeah.
but more often.
What's your playtime look like, Christina? I know you've got some things that you do too.
Well, I like this idea of a Friday play day.
You can come over.
All right, yeah. I guess the play for me comes more with trying different materials. So now that once I have the mold, I feel like I can do anything with it, and if what comes out of the mold fails, it's no big deal because I can just cast another one. So I've done things like casting concrete in a way where it's kind of thicker and doesn't really completely fill in the mold. So when you demold the figure, there are gaps and voids and things that are interesting and, again, unpredictable in a similar way to the unpredictability of the regular series. And I cast expandable foam into them and tried to come up with different ways of distorting the figure by spraying things onto the foam and other things to see what I could get to happen.
Haven't I seen googly eyes on a foam?
Yeah, the foam one ended up with not googly eyes, but it was doll eyes.
Doll eyes, right?
Yeah,
right.
yeah, against a face that was eroded.
Yeah, that definitely qualifies as playtime.
Yeah.
But it's fun though. I think that's one of the benefits of the silicone molds is like really being able to explore materials in a different way,
Right.
and to see what they do. But that relationship of your time with the clay to the translation of material is so fascinating too. Like it's so much about your engagement with rendering, like because you could take a life cast of somebody, right? But it was important for you to render that, in sort of discovering the person physically, and then I'm switching a little bit from play, but then discovering their interiority through removing their exteriority. But
Right. Yeah, I talk about that idea of life casting versus modeling, when I do like my regular talk about my work, because it's important to me with these portraits that these are about my perception of a person or my relationship with a person, and life casting so much becomes about the absence of the person. They become kind of like a death mask, and I'm not interested in those associations, and I enjoy sculpting. I think we can get into this mode where we conceptualize things to the point where we talk ourselves out of doing things, and you have to enjoy the process, and I like doing it for one.
Yeah.
And then also I'm not interested in the associations of life casting.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an investigation and a sort of archiving your relationship with somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other audience questions? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Haywan. I'm a current graduate student, also majoring in ceramics. I'm really enjoying the work in the sense of how the process is frozen in the object in diverse ways. But I'm also thinking that for the knowledge that I have in the ceramic process, it's allowing me to enjoy the work, and it's allowing me to sense the process from the visual elements and the structural elements of the final objects. So I'm curious how you guys would deal with audience that doesn't have any background in the ceramic process, or would it even matter to you guys?
Like, would they have to know about the mold? Like that mold making exists to get to the end result of the process?
Like, would it matter for the audience to so like, is it okay for them to just approach it as a visual element, or would you prefer audiences to get into the ceramics context and understand that?
That's an awesome question.
Should I?
Sure.
I just think, for me, I think it's more about content, personally. I don't know that they have to know about the molds, although most people, I think, for me, understand that I'm using something to replicate, because the quantity that I use is so much. To do each part separate would be insanity. So I'm more interested in the quantity being able to expose the content.
You kind of touched on this earlier when you talked about wanting the seams to show, and so I guess there's a point where I guess you got to question, like, someone who doesn't have a background in the material, will they understand what those lines are?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And for me, it's like one of those that I can think about from the two different angles of the two different kind of bodies of work. One thing about the pots that I was making was that it was entirely dependent on somebody understanding the challenge that the process represented. And for that reason, probably 80% of my market that I was selling to was potters. And especially if you work with porcelain, you're more likely to buy my work because you know that porcelain is, you have a better understanding the more familiar you are with the process. And so there was that kind of embedded, and I find it a little bit problematic, especially if, you know, how is that sustainable if all of us are only addressing or selling things to us? You know, there's only so many of us that can do that. And so that was problematic within the work, and I'm trying with the new stuff. In one sense, the functional work is much simpler, and none of that really appears on the slides, but in one sense, I want to move towards just like design that could appeal to anybody who drinks coffee, you know, and I want to, in one sense, de-emphasize the process, but then also with another body of work, I'm up here talking strictly about process. I think process is more important to me, and I would like to get the work to a place where it's less important to the audience. Or a mystery, there's an element of mystery to the process where if you see something, you're like, I have no idea how this thing came into being. I feel like people who are less into the material and a less educated public are probably, hopefully, going to find it just a little bit more magical than those who aren't with the new stuff. So
I think with your older work, though, people who didn't understand the process would totally love it aesthetically. Like, I think the reason most of your market was other potters was just maybe like lack of exposure to a wider audience, maybe. Because I feel like if people saw it, they would want to own it, even if they didn't understand the process, because it was beautiful. Those lines totally enhanced the forms. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just contradicting you a
okay.
little. Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. Okay.
But yeah, I feel like I was on a panel earlier this week, and we started talking more about meaning, and those cups have a different meaning to potters than they do to everyone else.
Right.
To everyone else,
I understand that.
the meaning is strictly beautiful or like a flower that's a cup.
Right.
And to the potters, the meaning was almost not that at all. It was almost entirely like, this guy's crazy. How did that thing get created? Why is he doing this to himself? Right? And I need to get one before he stops, probably.
Right. Yeah. No, I believe that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hello. This question is for Christina. I've noticed in a lot of your installations, it has a lot to do with like the viewer's relationship to the figures and also relationship to space. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and how that concept developed. Yeah.
It's very big. Well, so it was a interest that came about very early on in my making of sculpture. I don't know exactly like how to like where it came from exactly, but in grad school, like my first semester, I made an installation that was just figures in a space and some color sort of defining this, like kind of claiming the space as the figure's world that you were stepping into. And so part of the reason actually I started doing sculpture, because I started out as a painter and then I switched to sculpting in clay, is I just love the presence that a sculpture has. You know, when you approach something that feels like it's another body, though you know it's just an object, and that kind of push and pull of like relating to it and kind of feeling like you shouldn't be looking at it, but then knowing you can look at it because it's an object and all of that. So I was just interested in all that stuff very early on. And then the installations have gradually become more complex in their use of space. And so in my most recent installation, I built a small room, a 16 by 16 foot room that's turned at an angle in the gallery. So it not only created a small space to step into, but then there were spaces created on the outside of those walls where corners met the gallery walls and things. And so there were windows and peepholes and things for different kinds of viewing experiences. And and the viewer is more implicated in the work, with mirrors and other people looking through windows at you while you're looking at things. And I don't know if I am going to be able to answer this question
Thank
real
you.
well,
That's great.
concisely.
Yeah.
So to expand on that a little bit, in relationship to where you're making manipulation and where the mold is allowing you to think about some of those things differently. So one reason you come to molds is to be able to multiply the figure that you've originally sculpted. So in the past, you would have one rendered figure that you were able to do in an installation, but you didn't
Right.
have the same sort of opportunities for maybe dealing with space in more dynamic ways based on being able to simply occupy the space with more figures faster. So have some of those ideas in relationship to space changed simply because you have molds at your disposal now?
Have I been using more figures in the space? And
Well, the way your most recent piece where you've adjusted the space, you have a 16 by 16 foot thing. Did that come about? Would you have had that idea necessarily if you didn't have multiple figures and the ability to multiply your figures? And there's sort of reflective moments in that piece.
I think it would. I mean, I know you want all these connections to happen with mold making, but
Well, it doesn't have to. I'm just curious if it has.
I think like my
it's the
interest in
query.
space is it's been growing over the years, and the figures almost are like a lure to get people into the space, or like they're an excuse to get people in there so they have something to look at.
Yeah.
And then and it is more about the experience of, I mean, I guess they're important because the experience of how your body feels next to a body that's out of proportion or out of our scale, either too small or too large, and but the way the space adds to that sense of scale, either being diminished or increased, that it's all working together. But I think that would have evolved anyway.
Yeah, that aspect. But there's some little nuances that I feel are dependent still on the process.
Yeah, what's
Like
happening
the
because of
repetitiveness
the multiples is the work is not quite as narrative. Like there's just a thing that happens with figurative sculpture where you put two figures next to each other and you start to project about what's happening between them. And from the beginning, I've been most interested in that projection that we do about like how we start guessing and we want to know what's going on. And so I would make these really ambiguous scenes where there was no, like I wasn't literally illustrating a scene where like, oh, it's a boyfriend and girlfriend walking through the park or something, but like they kind of had a mundane, ordinary quality to them, but you weren't exactly sure what was happening. And I was most interested in that ambiguity and our questioning. And so now that I have multiple figures, I can do things where it's the same figure relating to itself.
Right.
And so it kind of takes the narrative in a way that isn't as direct and kind of reroutes it a little bit. It kind of seems a little bit more metaphoric or something, like it's a reflection or the figure is mirrored instead of it's actually like in conversation.
Right. Yeah. Those intrigue me a lot too. Like that.
Yeah.
And that became available through the process. I
Right,
think
that's
a little
true.
bit. That
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Yeah, that was important for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions, if there are any more. And no. Do you guys have any questions for anybody else? No.
Putting us on the spot here.
Sorry, I didn't. That's the different. Well, you are on the spot. I mean,
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Fair.
yeah.
Um,
No.
I mean, yeah, I think we could. I'm okay if we call it done.
Thanks,
not
Jeff.
that- no, it's great, but I mean, we don't need to like force.
We don't need to
Force it.
force
Stuff.
content
Yeah.
on
So-
Yeah.
I mean, if there's no other questions from the audience,
Yeah.
then
Here's a question.
oh, cool.
See, actually, I came in kind of late. I'm a figure sculptor and I make large figures. But like you said, that the figure is never the central or the most important piece for you, and it's just to draw in the audience a little bit.
That might be an exaggeration. That's how I'm starting to feel. Like I kind of, like, I don't think I can, like right now I can't envision an installation without at least one figure in it. But it's, for me, it's, like I really enjoy making the figures, but when I'm conceiving of an installation, they're just one part of the whole concept of how people move through the space and how they're going to be implicated in the work and how the overall sense of scale is experienced of the space and so it's like one component. It's not like like my studio practice isn't only about sculpting figures.
See, but I see this trend of like sculptors and ceramicists going more towards the space and the depth space. Like we just had Joe Page do a
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yep.
installation at a museum and at the VAC. And it was all like, we worked with him for days and days, and it was all about the space and interacting, and there were no figures.
Right.
Installation.
The figure is there.
Yeah. Well, I will say I do both.
say it's
I do both. So I have the installation work, and then I have the series of portrait busts that I create, which we were talking about more for this panel here. But I'm working on those simultaneously, and those are individual objects. You know, they go to a show, they're placed on a pedestal in a very traditional way. It is about the object for that work. So I do both, but yeah.
You feel like, I guess it's the modern trend. It's something I've had to rethink my figure sculpture because I feel that it's more about the installation and about the story and about people interacting with the pieces.
It may be that you're more aware of it now, but it's been going on for a really long time. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really a part of the viewer being more involved in the space in a way. That's how I think about it. I think it's integral to making work in a way. I mean, but it has been going on for a long time, and I just think it could be like trendy, I guess, or, but it's just a way of the viewer being a part of it and taking part in it that doesn't, in a different way than like being in the space of an object versus being in the physical space of the, with the object. I think they're kind of two different experiences. I mean, you might be able to actually talk about that too. That it's different how some, oh, well, I don't, like I have your work at my house. Well, sorry. I mean, I just sort of think like how I would be a part of, Brian's work versus Christina's versus any of our work is very different. Right, and so how you experience someone's work, and whether you're the viewer or the maker, it crosses over a different kind of place with what the work is and how your body can be a part of the space. I guess that's kind of how I think.
Yeah,
Because like your body is involved in your space,
Right.
but different part of myself would be involved in your space.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I think about
Physical
it.
engagement. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's
Yes.
true.
So maybe that's kind of what you're talking about.
Partly, yes, and Joe Page is all about that.
Yeah.
So he talked in detail about it. But the one thing is, how do you all feel about like an audience actually touching and feeling your pieces? And do you feel that the museums should now change their concept of the audience being just dumb and like standing away from the pieces, allowing them to actually touch?
I think that has to be considered on an individual basis,
Yeah.
depending on the concept of the piece. I could see making a piece where I was like, I want people's hands all over these figures, but that doesn't mean that it's like wrong to tell people not to touch the work.
Right.
Like I I think it's just a conceptual choice, and
I touch everything. And I feel like as a ceramic person, I'm allowed to, even though I'm wherever I am. But I really do. Yeah, I know. Sorry. I touch everybody's work. And I honestly think that, like, I mean, my work is difficult to touch and people are scared of it in a lot of ways. But really, it invites you to touch it. I mean, yours does too.
Yeah, and my stuff, people are horrified about touching it sometimes. I do retail craft shows, and it's translucent work, and people just don't want to touch it. But they want to know how much it costs possibly, so they kind of have to. So I usually just pick it up and put it in their hands, and it's taking that preciousness away from it. You know, for me, with utilitarian work, it's taking that preciousness away that I like, but then having that intimate experience, you know, and it only happens momentarily before someone makes a purchase, typically. But then, as you take that home, and you're in your own intimate space with this thing, having this intimate experience, it reveals itself. Okay, it reveals why I made it, and it reveals itself over time, too. It's not like quick. And I mean, sometimes I buy work that I don't understand just because I know it's good, and I don't know why it's good. And I want to know why it's good. Does that make that might not make any? I waste a lot of money possibly.
Well, can you also just lastly, Brian, expand a little bit on tactility, because it's so integral to your work too. So you're making decisions also based on what textures you're using that have been molded and then made into these objects. You're leaving some raw clay and some glazed areas. And I mean, I know I love using the cup that I have of yours, and it's like the temperature of the liquid that's inside it translates to my hand so quickly, but it's different sensation from the raw side to the glazed side. How do you think about those things?
Well, I just, it's really spontaneous, to be honest. I mean, as spontaneous as a slip cast piece can possibly be, but in making the blank and then building up the skin on top of that before I cast that to make multiples from. I'm always thinking about how it feels. Part of the way I developed textures in my work was because my grandmother had progressive arthritis in her hands, and she drank bourbon, you know, on the rocks. And when you drink bourbon on the rocks and you can't grip that glass so tight, it's a problem. So, you know, I had to keep my grandma pickled. So I made these textures that, you know, you don't have to squeeze so hard to have them in your hand. And it's true, though. I mean, and with my kid, too, you know, he didn't want the double-handled cup anymore, you know, and so I started making things that were easier to grip, and it's going through a whole, really, industrial design process about, you know, what textures translate heat more effectively because of surface area or lack of surface area. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, it's a simple cup. I make simple cups, but I think I put a lot of thought into things, into tactility. And just, again, you know, just having that place to rub on a cup, that little imperfection, or even on these bottles, this little ribbing up here, you know, this is awesome.
Yeah.
And I like that. So, yeah. I try not to have that be, you know, too important to it. I mean, it is physically, you know, I lose a lot of sales because people want to put like a hot cup of tea, the way Americans make tea, into a handleless cup that's paper thin. And that's an excellent way to burn yourself. So I talk people out of buying my work sometimes too because of physics, just simple, you know, heat transmission. But, you know, I push material. I like pushing material, and part of me using molds is actually pushing material to be as thin as it can possibly be. So, you know, I use slip cast slabs that I cast over molds, and that's not evident up here. But I can cast these slabs to be about 1 millimeter thick, and then I can press that into my texture, and so they're painfully thin. They're like paper, Wayfair thin. So to me, it's sexy you know, porcelain has to be sexy. So, you know, thin or thick, it's got to be one or the other. I don't know if that answered that at all. Possibly not. It's okay.
So we'll end on porcelain being sexy, and I want to thank you guys so much for being here and doing this with me. And
Thanks, Teran.
thanks.
Thanks, Dan.